In this first deal, just be okay with a little bit of money being at risk. And that's what I did on this first one. And I think that's the best lesson I've learned is I didn't do a good deal as the first deal. It didn't go well. It didn't go nearly as well as I would have liked it to. And I don't have that great first deal killer return story that jump started the rest of the business. What I did get out of it was a ton of education. And I took that mentality, for example, when we started raising money and doing slightly bigger deals. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another quick solo episode here on the Multifamily Wealth Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to share some details on the first deal that I ever did. It's been 10 years since I closed on my first deal. This is back in March of 2016. So a little bit of a milestone for me personally. And I think that there's some components to the first deal I did that are going to be relevant lessons, relevant pieces of information, tips, etc., to folks out there who are looking to do that first deal, or even folks who are already doing deals and have already begun investing, but want to prevent losing money or making mistakes on the next deal that you do. And I'm going to make these broadly applicable to both categories and then also to a wide spectrum of deal sizes, right? So I think these are lessons that apply to folks buying a duplex or folks buying a 20, 50, 100 unit building. And we're just going to jump right into it here. Some quick backstory or quick context on this first deal. This was a 3-unit deal that I found on Craigslist. It was a for sale by owner. And it was owned by an individual, a landlord who owned a number of buildings, 70, 80 units at the time, I believe, who was getting a little bit older and who was looking to sell. And this deal was financed with private debt. It was basically going to be a value add type of business plan. Get in there and renovate a couple of the units, push the rents on the others that we didn't have a chance to renovate, and then go ahead and refinance and hold on to it. I was in my hometown. It was an area I knew extremely well, and this was going to be a deal that I self-managed, and I did self-manage it. Now, a few things that came up that are going to really drive some of the lessons that I share here. Number one, this was an early 1900s built property, as a lot of the real estate is in New England. So, there was a number of components to this building that didn't, quote unquote, meet modern building standards. That said, that wasn't really an issue given the fact that that's a lot of the construction around this area. And there's a lot of folks who are financing these types of deals, whether those are conventional lenders or, FHA lenders or loans, etc. But there were a couple of components that were actually more problematic. It was serviced by private utilities. It had a septic tank. It had a dug well. Dug well is viewed less friendly by lenders, broadly speaking, than a drilled well, which is basically a deeper well. The septic tank was a little bit too small for a 3-unit building in terms of the gallons that it could hold. It needed to be pumped more regularly just from an operational standpoint as well. And long story short, when it came time to refinance or sell this building in a year, and the goal was to refinance it, realized that there were a lot of issues with finding lenders who were willing to finance it. And what I ended up deciding to do was just to sell the building, mainly because I just wanted to roll the capital into the next deal. Listed it at a price. I got my license throughout the time that I owned it, so listed it myself at a price that would have been a good outcome and was a well-supported price by all of the comparable sales. But as potential owner-occupant buyers kept walking through, I kept getting the feedback that, from agents or from the lenders when they would come out to look at it, that septic tank is too small, the dug well is an issue, there's some other issues with the building construction that disqualified from conventional financing. So long story short, I had to sell it to a buyer who paid cash for it, which significantly impacted my sales price and was an investor fundamentally. And I ended up selling the property at about what I paid for it, made some money in cash flow along the way, and spent a little bit of money on repairs. But luckily, I self-managed and the expenses weren't that high, so I ended up losing a few $1,000s. But the first lesson that I'm going to share here is you need to be extremely mindful of who your buyer is going to be or who your takeout lender is going to be. Basically, where is your liquidity going to come from when you go to execute a capital event on the deal that you buy? Obviously relevant to this deal, but this is relevant to everything that you look at. And this is a very broad, I think, in my opinion, a very broad lesson as it relates to where you can apply it. In this situation, there wasn't many buyers because of some intrinsic nature or intrinsic aspects of the building construction. And sure, I could have fixed some of them, but it would have been extremely costly and it just wouldn't have made sense to do that. Now, I'm going to share some other examples of this in more common practice in other deals. Let's say you're looking at a deal that's got some kind of a deed restriction. Maybe there's some easement on there for a neighbor that allows them to use your property or something like that. Let's say you're looking at a property that's just in a really weird location, right? It's in a okay neighborhood, but within that neighborhood, it's next to a gas station and across the street from an auto body shop. That's going to impact your liquidity or the buyer pool, for example. Let's say there's some other dynamic at play here that's going to impact a buyer's ability to secure financing, or is it going to significantly impact your buyer pool? All of these are things that you need to consider when you're buying a property because, yeah, even if the numbers make sense from a cash flow standpoint, and a lot of people just buy property like this, they're like, oh, it cash flows, it makes sense operationally, it works for me, quote unquote, for me, and people are going to move in and they're going to pay rent, and therefore I'm going to hold on to it and I don't plan on selling it. You are going to sell most of the things that you buy at some point, right? And that's just a fundamental reality of real estate investing that a lot of newer investors, especially, just have a hard time embracing. So knowing that you're going to probably sell, very, very likely sell a building at some point, who's going to be the guy that shows up with a big bag of money and how are they going to get their lending or how are they going to get their debt, right? You need to make sure that there won't be roadblocks to that upfront. Now, the second somewhat similar lesson here is, especially when you're new, if you're going to buy a deal with private financing, you need to make sure that you're able to get some type of stabilized financing when you go to refi, if that's going to be your business plan. And for me, I got private lending. I was a 21-year-old guy who, didn't have any real estate experience, didn't have a W-2 job to go and bring to a bank, didn't have the personal financial statement or the tax returns that would support most conventional financing, even if it's commercial financing. And I went to a bank, to go and get a takeout loan, right, to go and refinance out of the private money I used on the way in. And the challenge that I found that I faced was, sure, deal makes sense, DSCR makes sense, cash flow makes sense. We're just a little uncomfortable with you as a borrower and as a guarantor. So we'll still issue, terms on the loan, but they're just not going to be as aggressive, right? And I was getting a whole lot of like, we're going to cap you at 70 LTV at a 20-year amortization period. And just fundamentally, the debt was not very attractive on the way out. So when you buy a building, you need to understand what your takeout financing is going to be if you're using some type of unique financing on the way in, whether that's a bridge loan, a hard money loan, private loan, seller financing, etc. Lesson number three is you need to rely on professionals early. And something that I very commonly see parroted by experienced real estate investors is you should self-manage up front. You should do your own work up front. When I say up front, like on your early deals, you should do these things yourself so that you understand how they are done and so that you learn them. And sure, that's, I guess, possible, right? I guess maybe that works for some people, but I personally didn't have that experience. I couldn't have had a more different experience. And for me, like doing, self-managing the property as a younger person was challenging. Managing contractors and managing vendors as a younger person with no frame of reference over what quote unquote industry standards are, over quote unquote what a normal construction timeline is, over what is a normal change order request from a GC, what's a normal tenant resident request, when should you bend, when shouldn't you? All of that stuff I was learning on the fly, and I was just burning money in mistakes along the way. And sure, I learned some stuff, but like I could have just learned that watching a professional do it, right? So for me, if I were to go and do it over again, I just would hire a property manager on deal one and just observe them closely. Ask them why they make the decisions that they do. Ask them for their recommendations when we're facing challenges. Look at some of the standard contract language. Look at the lease they use. Look at how they paper contracts with their GCs and their vendors. Look at all of these different things and then just diligently asset manage and ask questions, right? I think that's going to be your best approach, especially if you're younger and especially if you don't come from a construction, real estate, property management background and you don't already have this experience to pull from. Now, an analogy I use is sure, if you got to go and learn some type of technical skill, let's say you're an electrician and you need to go run some wiring or you need to go install an outlet or a breaker or something like that, some simplistic task to an electrician. You can go and try to do it, maybe read an article, go in there and try to run the wiring and connect it and do all of that, watch a YouTube video. And you might do it, but it's probably going to take you much longer. You're probably going to make a lot of mistakes. You're probably going to, frankly, do it wrong the first time or the first couple of times, comparatively to if you just go and watch a master electrician do it and you just watch exactly what they do. You're not doing it yourself, maybe, but you're watching how they do it so that if you do want to go and do it yourself, you have the ability to go and do so. And fundamentally, I think that was a major mistake I made early on. Now, the fourth lesson that I want to share is you need to embrace learning on the fly, I think is the best way to put it, right? A lot of folks have a really hard time with the idea of everything not going perfectly when they set out to do their first deal or to make their first investment. And I think the easiest, one of the positive learning lessons I had was I lost money on this first deal. And I wasted a bunch of time, frankly. If we're going to look at wasting time definitively through spending a lot of time on this deal and spending a lot of energy getting it done and managing it just to make no money. It was a poor financial return, poor, return on time. But the lessons that I learned throughout this first deal made it so that deals 2 through 5, for example, the ones that really matter and the ones that actually really grow your business and set you up for financial success, those went far more, more effectively, right? Or I operated those effectively and they went far smoother. And there's a lot of things that you do on this first deal, and I'm going to say first deal or your next bigger deal whenever you make that big jump. For example, when you go from that 10 unit deal to that 50 unit deal, for example, what happens when you make that jump is you're really afraid of the things you don't know, and you spend so much time trying to educate yourself on the things that you think you need to know that you end up delaying all of these things, right? You end up delaying making all of the decisions that actually impact what happens or impacts your ability to grow. When in reality, you're never just going to be able to prepare yourself for all of these things, right? At some point, you need to get the education that allows you to feel somewhat confident making that step. Maybe lean on a connection of some kind who you can bounce questions off of as you try to make that jump or do that first deal. And then understand that you are going to learn a lot of things along the way. And just embrace that, right? Embrace that uncertainty. Like this first deal, there was no amount of time, or and if there was an amount of time, it would have been a disadvantageous amount of time spent on educating myself to where I would have delayed getting into the business and therefore would not have made sense to invest as much time. For example, in trying to determine what happens if there's a dug well on a property versus a drilled well, and like what are the ramifications of that? Like, that is something that maybe there's some listeners that are like, dude, you should have known that. And that's fair, right? But there's going to be something like that on these deals that you just don't know until you're in it. And the way that you hedge against that is you just buy the property at a price that gives you a buffer. And if you're going to raise money to do this, then you better be darn sure that the downside is protected, in at least a quantifiable way. And just give your investors a massive chunk of the deal and give them more than you probably should or will in the future. And in this first deal, just be okay with a little bit of money being at risk. And that's what I did on this first one. And I think that's the best lesson I've learned is I didn't do a good deal as the first deal. It didn't go well. It didn't go nearly as well as I would have liked it to. And I don't have that great first deal killer return story that jump started the rest of the business. But what I did get out of it was a ton of education. And I took that mentality, for example, when we started raising money and doing slightly bigger deals. It's like I had done a whole bunch of these smaller deals, and when it came time to bring some investors in to go from doing predominantly 5 to 10 unit deals to doing a 40 unit deal, which is like the first big deal that I did, and work with a couple of partners and investors. I was like, hey, I'm going to learn some stuff as it relates to papering the operating agreement and the investor relations side and getting the tax returns done and doing all of this. But the big stuff is right. I know that these buildings are in a good area and that we're paying the right price for them. And yeah, there was a whole bunch of stuff that was learned along the way, but it was all lessons that were welcomed and they were learned knowing that they were going to come, right? And that there wasn't a perfectionist approach to getting into that, next one. So quick recap on the lessons here to round this out, because I'm going way longer than I thought I would on this one. Number one, know who your buyer is going to be, know who's going to be, who are you exiting this to? Who's showing up with a bag of cash to buy this building off of you in the future? And making sure that the property you're buying doesn't diminish your buyer pool. Number two, Understand where your takeout debt is going to come from and make sure that you're able to qualify for it before you get into a deal, specifically with alternative financing of some kind. Number three, rely on experts, specifically property managers, GCs, etc., on your early deals, and take diligent notes and learn from them to prevent you from making the costly mistakes you could have avoided. And number four, understand that you're going to make mistakes on your first deal or that next big deal that you're doing or trying to make a jump to do in your business, and embrace the uncertainty, right? Mitigate what you can, understand the big levers of what you need to focus on, and then mitigate, I should say, and then embrace the lessons that you are inevitably going to learn when you do get into that deal. Hopefully you guys found this episode valuable. If you learned something, leave the show a rating and review. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you guys on the next episode.